Welcome to Truth Report. I'm Alex Truth, and tonight we are pulling back the curtain on a series of interconnected stories that the mainstream press is treating as isolated events. They are not isolated. From Turkey tightening military transit rules, to Pakistan's fuel smuggling networks collapsing, to the ICC facing unprecedented pressure to drop war crimes charges against Netanyahu, to Russia condemning the killing of Ali Larijani, to Trump's own counterterrorism chief walking out the door over the Iran war, these stories form a single, disturbing picture of a region being reshaped by force.
And I'm Maya Clarity. Let's be absolutely clear about what's happening right now. The United States and Israel are waging a war on Iran, and the shockwaves are rippling across every border in the Middle East and South Asia. What we're seeing isn't just a military campaign, it's an economic war, a legal war, and a diplomatic war all happening simultaneously. Every story we're covering tonight is a direct consequence of that central reality. So let's start connecting the dots, because no one else in mainstream media seems willing to do it.
Let's begin with Turkey. Middle East Eye is reporting that the Turkish government has tightened controls on the transit and transfer of military equipment through its territory. On the surface, this sounds like responsible governance, cracking down on illicit arms trade. But let's ask the deeper question, why now? Turkey sits at one of the most critical geographic crossroads for weapons flowing into conflict zones across the Middle East. They've had years to tighten these rules. The timing tells you everything. This is happening in the context of a U.S.-Israeli military campaign against Iran.
Exactly, Alex. Turkey under Erdogan has historically played both sides, a NATO member that also maintained working relationships with Iran and Russia. But when the bombs start falling on Iran, Turkey has to pick a lane. Tightening military transit rules is Ankara's way of signaling to Washington, we're cooperating, we're not letting weapons flow to Iranian proxies through our territory. But here's what the press isn't telling you, this also means Turkey is positioning itself to be a gatekeeper. Control the flow of arms, and you control leverage. Erdogan doesn't do anything without extracting a price.
And think about who benefits from this move. The United States and Israel benefit because it chokes off one of the supply routes that could be used to resupply Iranian allied forces across the region, Hezbollah remnants, militias in Iraq and Syria. Turkey benefits because it gets to look like a responsible actor on the world stage while simultaneously gaining diplomatic capital it can spend later. Who loses? The people caught in the middle of these conflicts who were relying on those supply lines, and smaller states that now have even less ability to arm themselves defensively against much larger military powers.
There's another angle here that nobody is discussing. Turkey tightening transit rules also affects the Kurdish regions. When you control military transit, you control what weapons reach which groups. The YPG and Kurdish forces in northern Syria have long been a thorn in Ankara's side. This policy gives Turkey a legal framework to intercept shipments that might reach Kurdish fighters under the guise of stopping illicit arms trade. It's a dual-purpose policy, and the Western press is only reporting the surface-level narrative about cracking down on smuggling without examining who actually gets squeezed.
Now let's move to our second story, and this one really shows you the human cost of this war in ways that the cable news networks are completely ignoring. South China Morning Post is reporting from Pakistan's southwestern mountains, where pickup trucks loaded with plastic cans of Iranian fuel line dusty roads. Young people, kids in many cases, are unloading containers, filling smaller cans, and strapping them onto motorbikes to supply nearby markets. This fuel smuggling trade along the 900-kilometer Pakistan-Iran border has existed for decades. But the U.S.-Israeli strikes on Iran are destroying it.
This is where the war stops being an abstraction and starts being about real people's survival. The communities along the Pakistan-Iran border in Balochistan are some of the poorest on earth. For generations, the smuggled fuel trade has been their economic lifeline, not because they chose a life of crime, but because their governments abandoned them. Pakistan never built the infrastructure. Iran's sanctions-battered economy made cheap fuel available. A shadow economy emerged that fed families. Now the war has disrupted Iranian fuel production and supply chains, and those supplies crossing the border have dropped dramatically. These communities are being economically strangled as collateral damage.
And let's talk about the ripple effects that the South China Morning Post report hints at. When fuel supplies drop, prices rise, not just for the smugglers, but for every ordinary Pakistani in Balochistan who depends on that fuel for transportation, heating, cooking, and running small businesses. The formal economy in these border regions barely exists. You can't just flip a switch and replace smuggled Iranian fuel with fuel from the official Pakistani market, because the infrastructure isn't there and the prices are unaffordable. So what happens? People go without. Businesses close. Young men who were making a marginal living in the fuel trade become desperate and unemployed.
And here's the connection that no one in Washington wants you to make. When you destabilize the economic foundations of border communities in places like Balochistan, you create exactly the conditions that breed extremism and insurgency. The Pakistani Taliban, Baloch separatist groups, and other armed factions recruit from precisely these populations, young men with no economic prospects and a burning grievance against distant powers that destroyed their livelihoods. The Pentagon will spend billions fighting the next wave of militants that this war is creating, and not a single general will admit that the fuel smuggling collapse in Balochistan was part of the causal chain.
This is the strategic blindness that defines American foreign policy. You wage a war against Iran, and you think the consequences stop at Iran's borders. They never do. Pakistan is a nuclear-armed state with deep internal fractures, and you're destabilizing its most volatile border region as a side effect of your military campaign. The South China Morning Post is one of the few outlets even covering this angle, and they're based in Hong Kong, not Washington. Ask yourself why American media isn't on the ground in Balochistan showing you the kids strapping fuel cans to motorbikes while their economic future collapses.
Because that story doesn't serve the narrative. The narrative in Washington is that the Iran war is targeted, precise, and contained. Showing the fuel smugglers of Balochistan, showing the knock-on economic devastation spreading across borders, undermines that narrative completely. It shows a war that is sloppy, indiscriminate in its economic effects, and generating consequences that will haunt the region for decades. And this is just one border. Imagine what's happening along Iran's borders with Iraq, Afghanistan, and the Gulf states. The economic shockwaves are everywhere, but the cameras aren't.
Let's turn to our third story, and this one strikes at the very foundations of international law. Middle East Eye is asking the question that should be on the front page of every newspaper: will Israel and the Trump administration force the International Criminal Court to drop the arrest warrant against Benjamin Netanyahu? War crimes expert Kevin John Heller has been breaking down the pressure campaign being waged against the ICC, and it is staggering in its brazenness. We are watching in real time as the world's most powerful nations attempt to dismantle the only international mechanism for accountability against leaders who commit atrocities.
Let's lay out what's happening. The ICC issued an arrest warrant for Netanyahu related to the conduct of military operations that have killed tens of thousands of Palestinian civilians. This warrant represents one of the most significant actions the court has ever taken against a sitting leader of a U.S. allied nation. And the response from Israel and the Trump administration hasn't been to address the substance of the charges, it's been to attack the court itself. Sanctions against ICC officials, threats to cut funding, diplomatic pressure on member states. This isn't a legal defense. This is an assault on the institution of international justice.
Kevin Heller's analysis is critical here because he strips away the political spin and looks at the legal mechanics. The ICC doesn't just drop warrants because powerful countries are angry. There are legal processes. The prosecutor would have to withdraw charges, or the pre-trial chamber would have to vacate the warrant. But what Israel and Trump are doing is something more insidious. They're trying to create a political environment where the court feels it cannot function, where its staff fear for their safety and careers, where member states are too intimidated to cooperate with enforcement. You don't need to formally kill the ICC if you can make it too afraid to act.
And this connects directly to the broader Iran war. If you can establish the precedent that a sitting leader can wage a devastating military campaign, face war crimes charges, and then simply bully the court into submission, you've effectively created a license for future atrocities. Every leader watching this calculus is taking notes. If Netanyahu escapes accountability, what message does that send to every other head of state contemplating a military operation that will kill civilians? It says, as long as you have Washington's backing, international law doesn't apply to you. The ICC becomes a court that only prosecutes African leaders and enemies of the West.
This is the two-tiered justice system that the global South has been warning about for decades. When Omar al-Bashir of Sudan was wanted by the ICC, Western nations demanded his arrest everywhere he traveled. When Putin was indicted, Western media celebrated it as a triumph of international law. But when the same court turns its attention to an American ally, suddenly the institution itself is illegitimate, suddenly the prosecutors are biased, suddenly the whole framework needs to be torn down. You cannot claim to support a rules-based international order and simultaneously threaten to destroy the court when it rules against your allies.
And here's what the mainstream coverage consistently misses. The pressure on the ICC isn't just coming from official government channels. There's a massive lobbying and media campaign designed to delegitimize the court in public opinion. think tanks funded by pro-Israel donors are publishing papers questioning the court's jurisdiction. Media outlets are running opinion pieces framing the warrant as anti-Semitic. Social media campaigns are targeting individual ICC staff members. This is a full-spectrum information war against an international institution, and most journalists are too afraid of being labeled anti-Semitic to report on it honestly.
Now let's connect this to our fourth story, because the killing of Ali Larijani brings the war crimes question into even sharper focus. Middle East Eye reports that Russia has condemned what it calls the murder of Iranian officials including security chief Ali Larijani, following Israeli strikes. Let's be clear about what happened here. This is the targeted assassination of a senior government official of a sovereign nation. Larijani wasn't a militia leader hiding in a cave. He was a prominent political and security figure in the Iranian government with decades of public service.
The word Russia used, murder, is deliberately chosen and legally significant. Under international law, the targeted killing of government officials of a country you're not formally at war with raises profound legal questions. And here's the uncomfortable truth: neither the United States nor Israel has formally declared war on Iran. What we have is an escalating series of military strikes being conducted without the legal framework that traditionally governs warfare between nations. When Russia calls this murder, they're making a legal argument, not just a political statement. And it's an argument that much of the international legal community would quietly agree with.
Ali Larijani was not a marginal figure. He was deeply connected to the Iranian political establishment, had served in multiple senior roles, and was considered a relatively pragmatic voice within the Iranian system. His killing sends a message that goes far beyond military strategy. It says no one in the Iranian government is safe, regardless of their role or their position on diplomacy versus confrontation. Think about what that does to any possibility of future negotiations. You've just told every potential Iranian negotiating partner that sitting across the table from the West won't protect them from a missile.
And Russia's condemnation is strategically calculated as well. Moscow has been deepening its relationship with Tehran throughout this conflict, and condemning the killing of Larijani serves multiple purposes. It positions Russia as a defender of sovereignty and international law, ironic given Ukraine, but strategically effective in the global south. It strengthens Russia's hand in any future negotiations over the conflict. And it puts further distance between Moscow and Washington at a time when the Trump administration might otherwise be seeking Russian cooperation on other issues. Every death in this war reshuffles the geopolitical deck.
What the Western media refuses to grapple with is the precedent being set. If Israel can assassinate senior Iranian officials with apparent American support and face no consequences, no ICC prosecution, no meaningful UN action, no sanctions, then we have entered a world where targeted killings of government officials are simply an accepted tool of statecraft for those with sufficient military power. Russia condemns it today, but what stops Russia from applying the same logic tomorrow? What stops China? What stops any nuclear-armed state from deciding that assassination is more efficient than diplomacy?
This is the erosion of the international order happening in real time, and it connects directly back to the ICC story. The mechanisms that were supposed to prevent exactly this kind of behavior, international courts, the UN Security Council, treaty obligations, are all being systematically undermined or simply ignored. When Russia condemns the murder of Larijani, they're not wrong on the legal substance, even if their motives are self-serving. The killing of government officials outside of a formally declared war is a violation of international norms that have existed since the Peace of Westphalia. We are watching centuries of diplomatic framework being dismantled.
And that brings us to our fifth story, which might be the most revealing of all. Al Jazeera reports that Joe Kent, Trump's own counterterrorism chief, has resigned over the Iran war, saying he cannot support the conflict. Let that sink in. This is not some liberal anti-war activist. This is not a progressive Democrat grandstanding. Joe Kent is a former Green Beret, a combat veteran, a man who was selected by the Trump administration specifically for his hawkish credentials. When someone like Joe Kent walks away from a war, it tells you something is profoundly wrong with how that war is being conducted.
The significance of this resignation cannot be overstated. Joe Kent has spent his career in the most dangerous counterterrorism operations the United States has conducted. He has seen war up close. He understands the costs. And he looked at what the United States is doing in Iran and said, I cannot put my name on this. The question every American should be asking is, what does Joe Kent know that we don't? What is happening in this war that is so far beyond the pale that a decorated Special Forces veteran who built his political career on being tough on terrorism felt compelled to resign in protest?
And notice how the mainstream media is covering this, or rather, not covering it. A story like this should dominate the news cycle for weeks. The president's own counterterrorism chief resigning over a war in progress is an earthquake. It suggests deep disagreements within the administration about the conduct, legality, or strategic wisdom of the conflict. But instead of treating this as the five-alarm fire it is, most outlets are running it as a brief item and moving on. They don't want to pull on this thread because they're afraid of where it leads, to fundamental questions about whether this war is legal, justified, or even achievable.
Let's think about what specifically might have driven Kent to resign. As counterterrorism chief, his portfolio would include assessing whether military operations are creating more terrorists than they're eliminating. He would have access to intelligence about the second and third-order effects of the strikes on Iran, the destabilization we talked about in Balochistan, the radicalization happening across the region, the collapse of intelligence-sharing arrangements with partners who are uncomfortable with the war's scope. If the classified picture is as bad as the open-source picture suggests, Kent may have concluded that this war is making America less safe, not more.
And there's a pattern here that historians will recognize. During Vietnam, it was the resignations and leaks from inside the national security establishment that eventually turned public opinion. Daniel Ellsberg wasn't an anti-war protester, he was a Rand Corporation analyst with top-secret clearance who saw the internal assessments and couldn't stay silent. Joe Kent's resignation could be the first crack in the dam. If the counterterrorism chief is walking away, who else inside the administration is having the same doubts but hasn't yet found the courage to act on them?
Now let's connect all 5 of these stories together, because that's what Truth Report does, we show you the full picture. Turkey is repositioning itself as a gatekeeper of arms flows, extracting leverage from the chaos. Pakistan's border communities are being economically devastated by a war they have no part in. The ICC is being bullied into abandoning accountability for war crimes. Senior Iranian officials are being assassinated in what Russia correctly identifies as extrajudicial killings. And Trump's own counterterrorism chief has concluded that the war is indefensible. This is not 5 separate stories. This is one story, the story of a war that is spiraling beyond anyone's control.
And at the center of all of it is a fundamental question of accountability. Who authorized this war? The United States Congress has not declared war on Iran. There has been no authorization for use of military force specifically targeting Iran. The legal basis for these operations is murky at best and non-existent at worst. The Trump administration is waging a major military campaign against a sovereign nation based on executive authority claims that would make the founders of this republic spin in their graves. And Congress, both parties, is largely silent, because challenging a war in progress is politically risky.
The absence of congressional authorization is the thread that ties everything together. Without a formal legal framework for this war, everything that flows from it exists in a legal gray zone. The targeted killings of Iranian officials, gray zone. The economic devastation in countries like Pakistan, unaccounted for collateral damage with no congressional oversight. The pressure on the ICC, an executive branch acting without legislative check. Turkey's repositioning, a NATO ally hedging because there's no clear legal framework governing what the US is actually doing. Joe Kent's resignation, a principled official who couldn't find legal or moral ground to stand on.
And this is where we need to talk about what the media's role should be versus what it actually is. Right now, American mainstream media is largely functioning as a stenographer for the administration's talking points on the Iran war. You see retired generals on cable news explaining strike packages. You see anchors nodding along as officials describe precision targeting. What you don't see is investigative reporting on the ground in Balochistan. You don't see sustained coverage of the ICC pressure campaign. You don't see follow-up on Joe Kent's resignation asking what intelligence drove his decision. The media has learned nothing from Iraq.
The Iraq parallel is haunting and precise. In 2003, the American media failed catastrophically by accepting government claims at face value, by not asking hard questions about legal authorization, by not showing the human cost of war in sufficient detail, and by treating dissent within the national security establishment as a footnote rather than a front-page story. Every single one of those failures is being repeated right now with Iran. The sources are different: Middle East Eye, South China Morning Post, Al Jazeera. Outlets outside the American media ecosystem are doing the journalism that American outlets should be doing.
Let's talk about who benefits from all of this, because that's always the question that cuts through the noise. The defense industry benefits. Every missile fired at Iran is a missile that needs to be replaced, and those contracts are worth billions. Certain political actors benefit. Netanyahu faces war crimes charges, and a wider war distracts from that legal jeopardy while rallying domestic support. Regional powers like Turkey and Saudi Arabia benefit from Iran being weakened, even as they publicly express concern. And the surveillance and security state benefits, because war always expands executive power and contracts civil liberties.
Who loses? Iranian civilians who are dying in strikes and suffering economic collapse. Pakistani border communities whose livelihoods are being destroyed. Palestinian civilians who see the one institution that might hold their oppressors accountable, the ICC, being systematically dismantled. American service members who may be deployed into an escalating conflict without clear legal authorization or achievable objectives. And fundamentally, the entire framework of international law and norms that was built after World War II to prevent exactly this kind of unchecked military aggression loses. We all lose when the rules stop applying to the powerful.
I want to come back to the Joe Kent resignation because I think it deserves special emphasis. When we cover wars, we often focus on the grand strategic picture and lose sight of the individual moral choices being made. Joe Kent made a choice. He had a prestigious position, access to power, a platform to influence policy from the inside. And he walked away because his conscience wouldn't let him stay. That kind of moral courage is rare in Washington, and it deserves recognition regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum. The question is whether anyone will follow his lead.
And that question leads directly to our call to action, because this isn't just about what's happening in the halls of power, it's about what we as citizens do with this information. The stories we've covered tonight are being reported, but they're being reported in fragments by outlets scattered across the globe. It's up to you to piece them together, to see the pattern, to understand that a war on Iran isn't just a military operation in a distant country, it's an event that is reshaping the global order, destroying communities, undermining international law, and being conducted without democratic authorization.
So here's what we're asking you to do. First, demand that your representatives in Congress take a vote on the Iran war. No more hiding behind vague authorizations from decades ago. If this war is justified, put your name on it. Vote yes or vote no, but vote. Second, support independent journalism. The stories we covered tonight came from Middle East Eye, South China Morning Post, and Al Jazeera, outlets that are doing the work that American corporate media won't. Subscribe to them. Share their reporting. Fund investigative journalism that holds power accountable.
Third, pay attention to the ICC. The pressure campaign against the court is designed to happen quietly, behind closed doors, through sanctions and threats that most people never hear about. Make noise about it. Contact your representatives and tell them that undermining international courts undermines American credibility and the rules-based order we claim to support. Fourth, follow the Joe Kent story. His resignation is a signal flare. Press for congressional hearings. What did the counterterrorism chief see that made him walk away? The American public has a right to know, and the classification system should not be used to hide policy failures from democratic scrutiny.
And finally, refuse to accept the fragmented way these stories are being presented to you. When you see a story about Turkey tightening transit rules, ask, why now, and who benefits? When you see fuel smugglers in Pakistan struggling, ask, what war created this crisis? When you see the ICC under pressure, ask, who is afraid of accountability? When you see Russia condemning an assassination, ask, what legal framework permits this killing? And when you see a counterterrorism chief resign, ask, what truth is being hidden from us? Every story is connected. Every connection reveals power. And power, when exposed to sunlight, has to answer for itself.
That's the mission of Truth Report, not to tell you what to think, but to show you what's being hidden and trust you to think for yourselves. The war on Iran is not a contained, surgical operation. It is a region-wide catastrophe with economic, legal, and human consequences that will define the next generation of global politics. The sources are there for anyone willing to look beyond the mainstream narrative. Middle East Eye, South China Morning Post, Al Jazeera, independent legal scholars like Kevin John Heller, they're doing the work. Our job is to connect it for you. Your job is to act on it.
I'm Alex Truth. This has been Truth Report. Stay informed, stay critical, and never stop asking who benefits. We'll see you next time.